Reed, thanks for joining.
Of course.
Okay, I think we have majority. We'll go ahead and get started since we do have a 2-hour meeting ahead of us. I already know that a few people have to take the call, like the second hour from the road, or maybe have to drop off. So appreciate whatever time you can give us here, whether it's the whole 2 hours or part of it. As I said at our last meeting, we do record all of the meetings. It's being recorded already here. And we do share a copy of the PowerPoint deck as well in meeting outcomes. So it's our hope that if you aren't able to stay on for the whole 2 hours, that you can reference that material and catch up or comment as needed. And thank you all for completing the doodle poll and making yourselves available so quickly here the following week after our first meeting. And as well, we scheduled another meeting. I believe it's the 28th, the end of the month, our third meeting as well. So hopefully most of you are available for that meeting too. So yes, good morning, afternoon. Thanks for joining. This is our second work group meeting for the U.S. early plugging of marginal oil and gas wells. I know we had our first meeting last week, and most of you were able to introduce yourself and are somewhat familiar now with our housekeeping and process. The work group members that are on screen here have panelist rights on Zoom, so you should be able to turn on and off your camera and unmute yourself to participate in discussion. You should also be able to use the raise hand function if you'd like to kind of put yourself in the queue to make comments on any of the material and slides during the discussion. We do open up all of our work group meetings for protocol development to observers in the public who aren't members of the active work group. So there are 4 observers, I think, right now online that are on listen only mode. They can provide questions or comments. I think it's in the Q&A function. So that is available to them, and staff Rachel, Jordan, myself will try to keep an eye on both the Q&A from observers, and you also as work group members can, I believe, use the chat function. I think you just have to make sure that you select that it's sent to everyone if you want to share that information with the entire work group and not just directly with us at the reserve. We'll do our best to monitor both the chat and the discussion verbally as you raise your hands or chime into the discussion. But of course, acknowledge it's difficult to manage both. So we appreciate your active commentary during our call. Yeah, and as mentioned, the slides and the recording will be posted on our protocol webpage. I believe our first meeting's already posted. We will share notes as well in meeting outcomes, and then as well for this meeting. You should probably all know me and my colleagues by now, but for those that weren't able to join the first call, I'm Mackenzie. I'm leading the protocol development here. I'm an associate director at the Reserve, and I'm joined by 2 staff members that are supporting Rachel Mooney and Jordan Mao, as well as our VP of the technical department, Kristen Gorgon-Poors, on the line as well. And we are acknowledging that we have partial support from Reed Calhoun at Climate Wells and collaborators that have helped draft the protocol and different sections for consideration. So we did have a chance last meeting for most of you to introduce yourselves. I know there were some conflicts for a few of you, so just wanted to take a moment to allow those work group members to briefly say hello, introduce themselves, who they are, what organization they're representing, and briefly their experience with oil and gas wells or greenhouse gas accounting. So I'll turn it over. I think we have 3 members, or at least 2 that I see now, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll turn it over to Dan Arthur first for a brief hello.
Um, Hi, it's good to see everybody. My name is Dan Arthur. I am the President, Chief Engineer of ALL Consulting, the CEO of Dynavert Holdings, which is a project developer. I am a petroleum engineer and geologist with about almost 45 years experience. I've been working in the environmental arena of oil and gas for nearly my entire career, or environmental and oil and gas and development and fracking and coal bed methane and reserve analysis. We do work for folks like the Securities and Exchange Commission. I've been involved as a VVB, as a, assisting various carbon registries. Very, very interested in this. I also sit on the Six Foundation, which is a pre-development mineral retirement nonprofit foundation.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I see Mark as well. I don't think you were able to join last time. I don't know if you'd like to briefly introduce
Yes, I
yourself as
wasn't.
well.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was traveling from Australia or Oceania back here, which is a very long flight, and I
Amazing.
was on the plane at the time. In any case, I come from a slightly different background. My climate experience is mainly outside of zero. So my interaction with Zero Wells is I'm on the board and the chief science officer of Zero Wells. It's a startup looking to develop a platform to facilitate and remove some of the barriers to plugging um, largely orphaned and abandoned wells, but also marginally producing wells. Look at the value streams, look at all the background history, the ownership history, and whatnot. So I'm scientifically advising them, and I'm involved in all sorts of discussions from that. So for 20 years, I've been in the energy sector largely. Went to Columbia and PhD and master's degrees, where I was at the Center for Life Cycle Analysis. So that's where my carbon accounting experience really originates from. Um, and I've sat on a bunch of boards, nationally and internationally. Mainly, I'm a scientist by trade, so I publish in the peer-reviewed journals in renewable energy and energy topics, climate accounting. You can look at my Google Scholar if you want to read all that stuff. That's my background. Very excited to be part of this because I think it's important.
Amazing. Thanks for joining, Mark. And yeah, I think I'm just seeing who else is on the line, but Brad Handler, I believe you're assisting Meg from EDF as potential alternate in this meeting or next. I don't know, not to put you on the spot if you want to say hello and also introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm glad to the chance to say hello and thank you for for letting me join you in this way. My name is Brad Handler. I work for the Payne Institute for Public Policy, which is a think tank that sits inside the Colorado School of Mines. Most of what I do is to guide the financial and economic research that supports all of the Payne Institute's initiatives. But methane reduction is an important one of our initiatives. And a lot of the work that I do focuses on the the ways that private capital can be brought in to facilitate climate mitigating activities like plugging wells. So I've done a lot of work with carbon markets and have looked a lot at the carbon crediting methodologies related to orphan and abandoned wells, and that's the overlap primarily with EDF at this point. So glad to join this group however I can, and looking forward to the rest of the meetings.
Great, thank you. I was just checking in on anyone else I'm missing. I don't think I see Jason on the line here today. I do see Paul. My apologies. I don't know if you are also representing Seneca and Associates or a different organization. Don't know if you're on mute. Rachel, I don't know, maybe you can check in or message in the background as needed. But I think that's the entirety of our group today. Thank you all for um, your participation last week if you were able to join and for introducing yourselves. I think it was great to get to know each other and start into the conversation. And thank you to the folks here too that are joining for the first time and have introduced themselves. So really, yeah, happy with this group and appreciate all of your expertise and time in advance. So we will jump right in. As you can imagine, we have a lot of information to share. A brief update on timeline so you know what to expect. We are hosting our second work group meeting here today. It is our hope to get through as much of the eligibility section as we can, which is our section 3, covering well, we'll come out of project definition and then we'll get into like location and start date and different additionality criteria, other crediting approaches and discussions. So we'll do as much as we can in the hour and 45 that we hopefully will have left. And then we do have already scheduled and slated in a third work group, or sorry, a second or third, we have a typo there, I guess it would be a fourth, a third work group meeting on January 28th for 2 hours. It's our hope to get through most of the quantification and any monitoring, reporting, and verification that we need to discuss. It's our impression that quantification and MRV will hopefully be a little bit more straightforward and simplistic once we figure out who's eligible and what kind of documentation and information needs to be shared by the wells. And then we will hold a fourth, as I said, a typo there, TBD, a fourth meeting the week of February 9th or February 16th. As needed, we have sent out an initial request for feedback to all of you for sections 2 and 3, which we're covering today, so that you can also provide written feedback whenever you would like. You can feel free to add in written comments and send that in to us at any time during this process. But right now we have a deadline of February 5th. Of course, that might change if we do need an additional meeting in early mid-February. It is still our goal to publish the protocol this spring of 2026. We have a board meeting on April 1st at our NACW conference in San Diego, where we are aiming to present and have that approved by the board in April. But we do have some alternative mechanisms with the board to present and move it forward as needed around that timeline. So TBD on the exact details, but this is generally the timelines that we're pushing towards and what you can expect from us. And I should say that we do have a public comment period. It's a 30-day public comment period. We're aiming for February or March. We do have a draft of the protocol that has been prepared by Climate Wells, and we do want to share that. I know I've got some inquiries from a few of you of if and when you will see a fulsome draft protocol that you can comment on, and it is our plan to do so. I think after this meeting, once we get feedback from you all on the first few sections, we can edit as needed and then share that in portions for your review and comment along the way. So stay tuned. We're not trying to keep that from you. We just want to make sure it's in the best shape after these discussions for your additional comments and feedback. So today the agenda, I mean, is pretty straightforward. We'll jump into key considerations, going through the different sections of the protocol and then turn to next steps. So the bulk of the meeting will be on actual criteria or considerations under the protocol sections. So I'll jump right into it. I do have a few slides.
Mackenzie,
Please.
just one question, and I'm sorry I wasn't here
No.
last time. I know Reed, I'm familiar with the ICR, and maybe this is, I don't know if this is a question for you or for him, but is this essentially a remake of the existing protocol from the ICR? Is it essentially copying that, or an improvement on it, or a change in it, or I'm just curious, like overall, so I haven't seen the actual protocol, so I'm just curious.
That's a great question. Yeah, and this versions of this protocol do exist, as you said, at different programs like ICR. So that is out there. We at the Reserve have like our own program standards and requirements. So we are taking, the ideas of that work. I would say, like, not necessarily like the ICR methodology, but rather the concept of, practice change being plugging of a marginal well and what emission reductions would be achieved from that, and working it through our template and processes from there. So the ideas are, mainly the same, but we are looking at how our protocol is structured and how it could fit into that work. I don't know if Reed or I see Kristen on screen as well, if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, this Reed's protocol is essentially kind of a base or a reference point for us at the Reserve, which means, it gives us a really good starting point and a good way to tee up a lot of like technical questions and issues and policy discussion. But, as part of this work group, we are considering all aspects, and there could be, changes made to kind of that underlying document. So that's kind of how I view it, as like it's a good starting point, reference-based protocol, but we're really opening up, the methodology here and asking again, asking all of the big questions. And yeah, so I guess kind of everything's on the table here in terms of, we're not making any assumptions about, if there's questions that you all have, like, please, yeah, raise them.
And one more thing that, I mean, that's was really helpful. But one more thing, and like when you look at definitions, like what a marginal well is a reserve looking at the changes that so many, state and governmental organizations are looking at and redefining what marginal wells are, and a lot of that's kind of up in the air. And we work with a lot of Indian tribes, and I know that was kind of addressed in some of the stuff I looked at, and there's a lot of concern about that and on like state and federal land. So we work for a lot of state land offices and so forth. And then also the idea of when we're in this point of high energy demand, the idea of leakage. So you plug a field here, and so now you just need to develop more right next to it or something. So I'm kind of wondering how we're looking at because there's a lot of change occurring, like that we're right in the middle of with data centers and everything else. And I'm just wondering if you've started to consider those things, and maybe you have. I'm just not aware. I'm just curious. So.
Yeah, all of the above. You'll see in the definition that we put forward is the DOE, like Federal Department of Energy, definition currently for marginal wells, which we had some commentary at our last meeting around why that would or wouldn't work. Yes, we welcome any like state variations or definitions and considerations so that we can make sure that it's applicable in any case, because we are proposing that, of course, that the protocol be applicable to any region, including tribal lands at this point, and that's a discussion on a later slide across the US. So we would need to know if there's any, major differences that we need to consider at a state level or for tribal lands as well. That being said, we will need to standardize as much as we can for like a US based protocol, and then make, notes of any key differences. So yes to all of the above. Leakage as well, that's a key consideration too. So exactly that, sort of everything's on the table, and like most things, timing is everything. We're obviously pushing forward with an April aim for publication, but we respect that there's always a lot of discussion, and we do have flexibility to continue to update our protocols, whether through minor and major revisions, to make sure things are up to date if anything comes out like after that date that should be considered.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Appreciate it. Keep going. And please feel free to raise your hand or chime in at any time. I'll pause after each slide, but welcome the questions, and thanks, Dan, for that. So we'll jump into definition. We talked about this, I'd say at length at our first meeting. It was really the topic of discussion, which is good. The proposal is avoidance of production-associated GHG emissions from marginal oil and gas wells by decommissioning and plugging these wells early and keeping hydrocarbons underground. A brief summary of the comments we received last week were to revise the definition to not only include production, but also use emissions. So I guess like extracting oil and gas, obviously including those emissions within the boundary. There was, I think, consensus that we don't necessarily need to define early in terms of like number of days or months or like a time frame, but rather use a decline curve to try to define and support what is marginal and not active, or orphaned or abandoned or inactive. We can talk more about that as needed. We also heard that there should be a consideration for how the definition looks at if it's individual wells or a grouping of multiple wells on a location, and how a project would be structured. And I think we also agreed, I let me know if not, that the direction that the reserve and we are moving in to develop a protocol specifically for marginal wells is what should be done, and that a protocol for orphaned or abandoned wells should be a separate but similar piece of work following this development. primarily because there are, I believe, key differences in what is common practice, what is data availability, what is quantification for those types of wells being orphaned and abandoned. Hopefully that's a good summary of what we presented at the last meeting and the main points of feedback we got from the group. Of course, we will use that to make edits to the definition that would then be shared later, but I'll pause briefly and ask if folks that were on the call last week feel we didn't capture something or you want to add to it, or if anyone who wasn't able to join last week had any questions or additional comments. Meg, please. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Mackenzie. I think you summed it up really well. Since then, I've had conversations with some of the economists at EDF who have been actively working on and modeling and looking at legacy well issues. And they have so I guess I have additional comments about additionality, but I could talk. I'm not sure at what point in the discussion that would be helpful. Maybe that would make sense later on. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to mention that I did want to relay what I learned from talking with some of our economists that are much smarter than I on this topic of additionality.
Yeah, amazing. We do have a few slides on additionality, so maybe keep them for that
Sure.
unless you
Okay,
feel
sounds good.
anything comes up now. Great, thank you. Looking forward to it. Dan?
Thanks. So I just wondered, you have on here, use of decline curve analysis, and that's certainly has applicability. But when you're looking at retiring, reserves in an area, there's like geologic data, maybe, seismic and microseismic or seismic analysis data and other things to do that reserve analysis, to account for all the reserves and not just the reserves that, say, particular wells are producing. So, for instance, one of the things happening, in current times is there's actually kind of a new push to go back and redevelop old conventional wells and doing things like, shallow horizontal development in old fields and so forth, because you find a lot of undeveloped reserves. So like one of the biggest oil fields ever to have existed in Oklahoma was the Glenpool oil field, just kind of south of Tulsa. And what you find is only about 11 to 15% of the oil was ever produced out of the Glenpool oil field. And it's similar things that you see in Osage County, which was, killers of the flower moon. And we've seen so many opportunities where by doing various different things to some of the old vertical marginal wells, taking them from producing less than a barrel of oil a day to producing 50 barrels of oil a day. So so if you just use the decline analysis on those wells that have declined, you could be missing a lot of the reserves that you never produce. And I'm just wondering if is the strategy just from the existing wells on how they or are we trying to include those overall actual reserve analysis? I mean, I'm used to working for the SEC and, and all those stuff where you're looking at not only the existing wells, but what's also there to develop. And I just want to make sure you're not missing that. So that's my question, comment, whatever.
Thank you. I think it's an excellent point. I think we, on the next slide, get into some of the like reserves in the well. I don't think it's just I think it's two things. The more we've been talking internally and looking to you all as the experts, but I think it's not only what is being like extracted and pulled, but what's also the reserves. And I think that would get to your points, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, thank you. And then Arjun.
Yeah, just to build on Dan's comment, or maybe add some more context to it. And I know that Climate Action Reserve knows this, but within the world of carbon offsets protocols and methodologies, I think that in this context, early would have to mean it's simply earlier than that well was otherwise going to be retired. Not early in the sense of how much oil could potentially be extracted from that well. And so that's the kind of counterfactual that has to be implied, I think, through the use of the word early here.
Mm, I see what you're saying, that, you know, and I think that's what we're going for, that it's on its way to being plugged, or that would be the best case if finances were available. So that's what the protocol would be, you know, motivating, is that action at a sooner date. Thank you. Meg?
Yeah, great discussion. I think what Dan's also getting at is that, you know, these marginal wells are in, you know, they're not in necessarily tight reservoirs. They're in permeable porous reservoirs, and so you can shut in one well, and then you can drill another well and access the same reservoir. You know, so if you know, you got to understand the geology and the reservoir dynamics as well, because of these stranded assets that could be developed another way.
Mm. So that comment,
Oops.
would there
So
be
it's
a
like,
motive?
it's actual, yeah, it's physical leakage. It's geologic leakage rather than economic leakage is what you have to also be aware of. So you kind of need an area of interest that is not, you know, these wells are not, they're connected. They're in reservoirs that communicate. I mean, often folks plug in one well to boost the production on another well. So that's a type of leakage.
Yeah, it's both of those things, or all of them. It gets complicated. That was my point.
So I guess a question, I see there's a couple other hands raised, but a question around the definition of like a single well versus multiple wells. Should there be some sort of safeguard or criteria here, that if a well that's being plugged as a part of the protocol, if it is interconnected in these ways, that the whole network, if I can call it that, of wells is being considered? Is that something we should require as a part of the project? Mark?
Yeah, I was just gonna, I'm kind of new to this area, but I completely agree. You know, the different reservoirs have different permeability. So there's different degrees of communication. And, you know, if you plug one hole, the pressure is going to increase in some of the other, even orphaned and abandoned wells nearby. So that needs to be taken into account because it's going to affect the neighboring wells' decline curves, you know, as a result. That's just something that needs to be taken into account. I don't know exactly how to do that because, I mean, Dan, you're probably the most knowledgeable on this field, but you know, to my knowledge, different reservoirs have different permeability. So you need to understand where the field is located, what reservoir it's part of, and some information about those different
Well,
reservoirs.
and oftentimes you have commingled production and other things that my point is it gets real complicated. So I'm just kind of wondering, are we going by the well, or are we actually going to the reservoir basis? Because if we're going to the reservoir, you know, it could be multiple formations that contain oil and gas and so forth. So it you know, it gets complicated.
Yeah, it gets
Helpful.
complicated. I think it'd be great to um, bound, you know, it needs to be bounded to a certain degree, but you know, where do we draw the boundaries?
Yeah,
Sorry,
we'll
I
be
don't have an
tasked
answer
with
to that,
find.
just a
No,
question.
no, appreciate it. It'll be an important balance between, I can imagine that it may be too administratively burdensome to have it so complicated to always include, you know, the entirety of, say, a reservoir, but what is the point at which we need to consider that and balance that with like project administration. Reed, you're on mute, sorry.
I'll try and simplify at least what the draft protocol says at the moment. The petroleum engineering firm that is hired in order to do work on this as a separate independent third party does three things. They define what the 1P or PDP reserves are to be produced by the well. So we're not talking about what would happen if there was massive mechanical intervention or two new wells on the property. It is what would happen in the business as usual case with just that well. Or if we're doing a project of 50 wells, what would happen in a business as usual case with those 50 wells? The second thing the petroleum engineer does is they define what early is. So the draft protocol says that nobody plugs a well while it is still economically profitable, because they don't. We've looked at every well in the US, and the average plugging date is after it stops becoming, after it can no longer make profit. So again, that's not determined by the project developer or the operator. It's done by an independent third party. So they've done two things, which is how much in reserves is going to be produced and what is the business as usual case for plugging the well. The third thing that they do is run the well through a quantitative and qualitative permanence review. And that is to figure out how permanent is the sequestration of these emissions going to be. So in a highly porous reservoir where we have no zonal isolation between the wells we're plugging and wells nearby, that's not going to really pass a permanence review from an independent petroleum engineering firm. They're going to determine that if we plug these wells, it's going to increase the production of the wells nearby. Now, if it's zonally isolated, or for one other reason, there is a reason to believe that the reserves that were going to be produced by that well, I'm not talking about deeper reserves that were not going to be produced by that well, but the reserves that were going to be produced in the business as usual case are going to be permanently sequestered, then you have all three pieces: how much it was going to produce throughout the rest of its economic life, when it was going to be plugged in the business as usual case, and a reason to believe that that plugging is going to cause a permanent sequestration of reserves that will not be produced by nearby wells. So luckily, all three of those really key pieces are not in the hand of the operator or the project developer. They are done by an independent third party who does not receive an incentive based on the project.
Thanks, Reed. I moved on to the next slide, as you might have noticed, since this is sort of the second part of the definition, and I think starts to talk about comments around using professional engineering firm and third parties like Reed is discussing to accomplish those three goals. Curious if that meets addresses any concerns that have been raised on the previous slide, but I also see Miguel has his hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Mackenzie. I agree with all the different interventions that have been made. One of the experience that we have regarding developing these oil and gas avoided type methodologies, I think should be that this should be tied to, I think, economic level at the beginning, because we know that this is very changing. The definition of early changes because as time progresses, the technology to extract wells becomes, I think, more available or more cost effective. So I think it is very important to make sure that this definition changes over time, that maybe the protocol changes and assess, of course, as it always does, what is going to be the baseline for this one. So I recommend that maybe we should be tightening this to the definition that the commissioning, while the well is still or has certified economic reserves from the petroleum engineer, like Reed mentions. But it is important also to mention, Reed, that maybe putting that definition into the petroleum firm engineer, everybody has different criteria, maybe to what would be considered early. So maybe we should leave this to the climate action reserve and to probably use like a conservative assumption about this. So maybe tie this to uh, economic, and that if these ones should be revised in a regular basis, maybe 5 years and so. I think that's it.
We have program requirements update our protocols at least every 3 years, so we can, of course, keep up to date with how that evolves, and we can definitely consider a standardized definition that it's a question the engineering firms would refer to for consistency if that's needed. Obviously, leaving professional judgment to them, but having some sort of benchmark. Dan?
Sorry to be seem like I'm taking over the conversation. I apologize, and I can be quiet if I need to be, but as you look on here, like on marginal wells and the 15 barrels of oil, or the IRS, the stuff that they do, one of the things that many of the states are dealing with now is looking at not only, and EDF has been involved in this, at least in New Mexico, but what has happened in different times is an operator will come out like one day a year and produce, 15 barrels or 25 barrels or whatever to be able to keep things open. So there's generally also becoming not only a rate, but also a total volume. So I think that there could be some things to be looking at this, beyond that. And I get all the things that Reed said, but also looking at, realizing that when we do those things, when you have that PE do those analysis, he's doing that on, say, existing data. And many times wells are kept so that they can, you know, you know, because there's other things that they see as potential going forward. So oftentimes just looking at the well and the well's production, and I'm just cautioning that there's a lot to consider.
Thank you. No, and I appreciate your comments. I think that's something even that I questioned internally and didn't have I know a lot of background or information on is there like a rate versus volume difference here? Like if we're looking at the entire like economic reserve and then what people are actually extracting, like could they define their well as marginal if they lower production before the project? Is that, something we need to safeguard against and have, historical data that this is the, entire volume and this has also been what they've been extracting for the last however, number of years to consider them marginal. So it's helpful to know that's a part of the discussion, Meg.
Oh yeah, I was just going to mention that that IRS definition, there's actually fine print in that where it's I guess the production can be as high in a particular day as 25 BOE or 75 BOE, but it has to average 3 barrels a day, BOE per day or equivalent or less over the year. So it's actually for the very low producing wells, and it's a tax credit, but it's, I guess, just something to keep in mind there.
Good to know. Tax credit maybe come up in a later discussion as well when we're talking about credit stacking and finance too. Thanks. Reed?
Just a quick reiteration. We don't actually care, or at least I'll say the methodology itself as written, the draft protocol doesn't necessarily care if the well is marginal, meaning 15 or 16 barrels of oil or 75 barrels of oil. We need it to be past its terminal decline such that any future production that would come from that well between the time in which you're plugging it and when it would have been plugged in the business as usual case is predictable. So marginal is a catch-all term that seems to catch wells that are old, that are past their terminal decline. So we can use an arbitrary production line, which is what the draft protocol says. It's actually using 75 barrels of oil equivalent per day because we found that most fields of marginal wells have one or two wells that produce above 15 barrels of oil, and we want to catch all of those. But really, it's just because it's very difficult to define when a well is past its terminal decline and has future predictable production. So that's what we're operating with is marginal. But I don't know that the best use of time is figuring out if we should use 15, 75, IRS. Really, our focus is how do we find wells that create the most emissions for the lowest amount of production and have the clearest, most predictable, ongoing, proved developed producing reserves.
Thanks, Reed. That's helpful because I was going to ask about the numbers. And so it's good to know that maybe we don't want to get down a rabbit hole of picking and choosing numbers on this call. But yeah, open to other thoughts, Mark.
Yeah, I like the approach, Reed. That feels like a good catch-all approach. I just wanted to say that there are some states, I believe North Dakota, that have depth and formation dependent thresholds for defining what is a marginally producing well. So the deeper it is, the more barrels it can produce to define. It's like 75 or something. I forget what the exact numbers are, but I just wanted to mention that.
Helpful. We'll bring that in. Okay. Any other? I think we've got a good path forward. I think we agree on the professional engineering firm, but maybe there's some standardized definitions we need to think about. I think on the previous call, we talked about, maybe the too narrow focus in this DOE definition around vertical and capturing horizontal as well. Seems like we don't want to get too caught up in the weeds on the specific numbers right now, but rather go forward with the approach of trying to target these wells that in a business as usual case are in their decline, would have been plugged at a later date, and rather, are being plugged early, and can start to gather all of the different definitions and fine print and figure out if we need to at least reference those or find some standard of how to define the direction we're going. Is that a fair synopsis or summary? Are there any other comments? Just mindful of time, we can jump into some other fun topics unless there's anything I've missed. This is sort of on a similar train. We didn't get to this at the last meeting, but of course we do have a whole quantification section around how to define the baseline scenario from a quantification standpoint of what your baseline emissions would be and how you're getting credited for that. The proposal in the current draft protocol is that it assumes the marginal well would have continued to operate until they reach their economic limit. What is the economic limit? Is that the right baseline scenario? And then we have a series of questions around that. Would this be a site by specific number that would be developed, and would this be provided by the third party that's certifying the well? Would they say, this is what the economic limit is? Would that be provided for quantification purposes, or is this something that would need to be modeled or measured and modeled? I know, Reed, you've done a lot of work on this. Is it common for wells to extract below their economic reserves? I think that hopefully is in line with some of the comments, and our thinking is there rate versus volume difference here? Like if we are defining marginal wells, I'm not saying we are, but if we're saying 15 or 75, is that the right thing to hang our hat on, or should we be considering rather the reserves and the entire volume? This would come from a third party professional engineering firm, I assume, unless you have other thoughts or corrections. Is there any conflict of interest that we need to be aware of? I believe these are third parties, but another question. And then can this be standardized? I don't know, like, is there a range for marginal wells that depending on certain criteria, they would fall within a certain economic limit or reserve? And then could we standardize that in a conservative fashion to make it easier for projects, or is that not the way to go? And what documentation are we looking at? Hopefully these questions all come together and make sense, and we'll open it up for your thoughts, Reed.
The proposal under the current draft is that a petroleum engineering firm would create a reserve report for a well. This does a lot of different things. By creating a reserve report, it defines the exact amount of economic profitable barrels to be produced between the date in which the reserve report was created and when the well would become non-economic, which functionally forms your baseline on what would be produced in a normal business case. Almost always, wells produce more than the economic reserve report. They'll often produce past that economic break-even point. So the common practice is not only to produce your economic reserves, but to continue to produce after that point. Often operators will turn a well off when commodity prices go low, and they'll turn it back on at a later date when they're high. So an economic reserve report for a long-lived marginal well is almost always conservative. And because it's in the hands of the petroleum engineering firm, you're standardized across all wells across the United States. There's a very common practice for how you create a reserve report. And the draft protocol has independence parameters to make sure there's no conflict of interest. Almost every large petroleum engineering firm out there is going to have independence in order to do these reserve reports for operators. So we sort of have it written such that these are SEC qualified reserve reports that are created.
Thanks, Reed. Agree, disagree, comments? Meg, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so that's super helpful, Reed. I guess just to relay the concerns that the economists have that I've been talking to. So their really chief concern with this whole thing is how you define what economic limits of production are in a conservative enough way that preserves plausible additionality. And they've been looking at the history of some of these wells, in particular. This is Lauren Beatty, the economist at EDF, who's been working on these kinds of problems for quite a while. And so she looked at a cohort of wells from Texas that were drilled between 1970 and 1975, and looked at wells that included wells of that cohort. And then she plotted up history of that cohort of wells from about 2005 to 2020. And I'll put this plot in the chat, but it shows about half of the wells in 2005 are active and half of them are shut in. And then what happens to those wells over time? And you can see this growing wedge over time of the plugged wells, cumulative, until about 2020, when over the half the wells are plugged. About a third of the inactive shut-in wells become plugged, and about a third of the active wells are plugged. And so it shows, the plugging rate over time. And I guess, what we're trying to do is accelerate that or change behavior. And the problem is how do you demonstrate or prove that these same firms that are choosing to plug their wells as they become uneconomic, or, they make an economic decision to plug those wells, aren't the same group that are going to also decide to plug these wells with carbon credits. So that's kind of the issue, is really, the whole additionality of whether these carbon credits are actually going to change behavior of the group that are remaining shut in or are marginal. And I'll put this plot in the chat. Obviously we all want to accelerate this pattern. The question is if you can demonstrate that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Not only, what the economic limit is and agreeing to that, but then of course behavior and what is, common practice, or would they have plugged those wells if they are reaching the economic limit, how fast. So yeah, that's helpful if you can share the plot, and we can continue that additionality discussion too. Wes?
So going right off of what Meg was just talking about, drilling vertical wells on an oil and gas lease, you have a limit of how much oil or gas can be produced from those wells. They're drilled vertically into the formation. At some point, when you get into an uneconomic state, an operator may choose to do secondary or tertiary recovery with water flooding, enhanced oil recovery. I don't want to assume anything. I would think that would go into the report, but is that what's going to be coming from the produced reserves in the future, where the engineer is going to look at that and say, if you water flood this, you could make 100 barrels a day. It's not currently making 100 barrels a day. It might only be making 14. So is that going to be factored into the report that gets generated as far as how much oil and gas is left in the ground? Or is that just going to be up to the engineer? Or is it in the protocol somewhere about how it's supposed to be treated? Because I think you would want to have some kind of guidance for the engineer and the operator as to how that needs to be accounted for, or whether it's even going to be allowed as part of the discussion.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think goes into the business as usual case. Like, what are the different baseline options here? Is it truly that well will end up getting plugged because there's no other options that you're talking about to increase activity, or is there some sort of other business as usual or baseline case where they're, offering other activity, like you're saying, that I assume will bring out, extra, production, but also emissions. So
Right. And kind of what Meg was saying, you may have 5 wells that aren't producing and 5 that are, and you've got 10 wells on the lease. Well, business as usual might be to turn 3 of those into injection wells. And then they serve a new purpose. And it would be an economic decision from an operator standpoint of, well, if I wish to go plug these wells, I can plug them and offset this and, I'll get carbon credits for that, or I can invest more money. And at that point, it is a business decision where they're not going to be going down the business as usual path because you've given them another alternative.
It's a good point. Yeah, I guess my question is do we want to safeguard against that? Like, is there a way to clearly define that those types of projects maybe aren't eligible because there's more, at stake here, more options than simply, a group or a single or group of wells that would all be plugged. I don't know. Is that a case study, or is that enough of, wells to have an impact? And should we be excluding the question marks when, it's an active and plugging situation? I don't know. Might get into ownership as well. We have a slide on that next of, what types of entities and folks could be owners of these types of projects. Should it be limited in any way? Hopefully that captures what you're saying, Wes, in terms of if there's multiple wells and how we're thinking about shifting. I mean, it's shifting production or leakage, I guess, or different business as usual cases. Reed, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll just try and answer at least what the draft protocol says today. So Wes, for your point, 1P reserves or PDP reserves are the only ones accounted for in the draft protocol. That does not include any mechanical intervention, water flooding, EOR, or anything that is beyond the current production decline curve of the well. Meaning you will not get any credit for reserves that are not on the current decline curve of the well and that would require any sort of additional work, even if it is common practice. Those are in 2P reserves, which is probable, which would require mechanical intervention access, or 3P reserves, which are possible, which again is only 10% likely. Probable reserves are 50% likely. The only thing credited is 90% likely current active decline curve base reserves. For Meg, your question, if EDF has examples of wells that indicated as common practice to plug them while active and while profitable, those are two key pieces. There's plenty that are profitable but not currently active, and there's plenty that are active but not currently profitable. If there is indication that there are wells that are being plugged while active and economically profitable, creating profits every day and month, it'd be great to see. We've looked across Enverus and consulted with them. We found that it's less than 0.5% of all wells that we've looked at. We've ever seen that case. And it's usually because they're being incentivized by a coal company to plug those wells early to allow for more coal extraction in the area. So we've accounted for that in the draft protocol. What we see a lot is wells for which the operator's taken it offline and they're trying to get a credit for plugging it now instead of bringing it back online later. Those wells would not be applicable under the protocol. Current draft protocol requires that wells have been active and profitable for 7 out of the previous 12 months. Now, maybe there's a better way to define what active is, but that's what's written in there today.
Thanks, Reed. Helpful comments all around. I mean, I think we need to obviously be aware of these situations and make sure that the protocol accounts for that, or limits eligibility against those situations at the very least. Miguel.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, yeah, I agree with Reed. And that's part of what we have been developing. The decline curve, I think it all ties up to the decline curve, unless Dan and somebody else corrects me. And yes, for the activity review of at least 12 months of lease operating, I think operating cost statements would actually also be evidence that the wells were active, and of course tied with the decline curve analysis and with the report that the petroleum engineer is going to provide. I think will be enough to determine the baseline. And here also, how can project developers determine size specific? Well, of course, the decline curve. Yeah, no common practice to do it unless the carbon financing, which is the purpose of this protocol. And we were also about the conflict of interest regarding the PPEF. It is important to mention that well, that a project petroleum engineering firm, is or does not exceed a certain percentage of annual revenue from this specific project operator, that is, or project developer or owner, just to make sure that there's no conflict of interest on the opinion of the petroleum engineering firm. That's more or less how we have done this with even PVPs in compliance market, for example, in Semarnat, among others. But yeah.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing from the group generally is that we want to target the wells, of course, that, have are going to reach their economic limit. There's not going to be other potential case studies where they're doing other activities to pull out more from the reserves, or some sort of situation where there's multiple wells and some are active, some aren't, and they're plugging. Is that generally consensus that there is this definition, or not definition, but there are these types of wells that would benefit from this protocol? Most of the marginal wells that we would target are in this situation. It is a business as usual case that they would keep extracting a limited amount for a set amount of time until they reach their end point, and that we could use some of these definitions to safeguard against, can I call them hedge, not typical cases where it may be that they're encouraged to do some of the actions to pull out more oil and gas, or if they plug, it has impacts on other active wells. I'm sure I'm not summarizing it in the best way, but is that what our biggest concern is here? Is that if we don't clearly define and safeguard against certain cases, they may be eligible when they really shouldn't be. Is that a fair summary?
I'll jump in. I think that's a legitimate concern. I mean, I think, as you know, what we've seen enough times in carbon markets is, the market responding as it would, and looking for those opportunities, where there are edge cases that can be pulled in and generate credits, that weren't really sort of within, right down the fairway as in terms of what was thought about when the protocol was written. So that's a concern that I would echo.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think that's what I'm hearing, is that like the intent is good, but then if we aren't tight enough with the definitions or have enough safeguards built in, there could be those edge cases that take benefit when it's really not the business as usual case, or there's other things going on. Meg?
Yeah, I think another concern is permanence as well. I mean, when you're, just the same point that Dan Arthur was making early on about, at the EIA, what we would do to try to project into the future whether an area is going to be produced or not is not so much on the reserves, but what the EIA and the USGS refers to as technically recoverable resource that's in the ground. So you look at that, and then you look at the future price scenarios, and that really what dictates whether an area is going to be produced is the price and the technically recoverable resource that's in the ground, because technology is continually changing. And at the EIA, I think they were predicting too low future production for a long time until they took a better look at not just the reserves, but the technically recoverable resources. So I think the permanence is a big issue, and yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you. So question, so is this engineering firm that would be hired and goes out to a well or a series of wells, they're able to go out and collect enough information to, this is a question, to determine the economic limit, to determine the technically recoverable. I think you referred to it, Meg, recoverable amounts, price. Are these things like on a site specific, project specific basis of either a single well or multiple wells that this firm could go out and report on, and then determine how it fits within protocol definitions to basically determine that certain projects are ineligible if they're don't fit any of these definitions, if they have more reserves, or they can, it's not going to be, there's a risk of permanence, or there's a risk of other, cases in the baseline. Is that a fair assumption that we could put that on that firm and then have like certain safeguards in areas that can't play, and then the firm could confirm that the project fits? Reed?
Yeah, short answer, yes. So the petroleum engineer is going to take a look at a set of project wells and come up with three types of reserves. 1P reserves, which means 90% likely to be produced under normal business as usual circumstance from this one well. 2P reserves, meaning if the well did enhanced oil recovery, or if they did a bunch of mechanical intervention to increase their production, something beyond business as usual. And the third piece is, what is the economically viable potential for the reservoir? That's your possible reserves, meaning if there were 10 new wells drilled here, how much is going to come out? So the draft protocol only takes into account a credit for stopping 1P reserves. You don't get some sort of credit for stopping something that is 50% likely or 10% likely. It is only the reserves that would have been produced by this one well bore. If we plug a well in a shallow vertical formation of marginal wells, we plug 20 of them, and someone wants to come in and drill a new well, the fact that someone is plugging those 10 marginal wells is a statement to the limited economics remaining under pressure in that reservoir. A new well that would be drilled to a different depth to go after a reservoir that's going to generate a lot more profitability. A new well is $9-10 million. So not typically going to be drilled into a very shallow formation to threaten the reserves that we're keeping in place. So the focus of the conversation is not what could be done here, how much reserves could be produced. It is what was this one well or this set of 5 wells going to do? And if it doesn't do that, that's the reserves that are sequestered that create credits. There is a 4 or 5 page permanence review to make sure that when we shut those wells down, it doesn't increase production next door. If it does, the wells are not going to be applicable. There's a permanence review for future production. And then each year there's a monitoring event. If somebody permits a new well that's going to threaten the reserves that we sequestered through plugging those wells, you've got to pull out of the buffer pool or otherwise, act in recompense to the buyer with fresh, high quality credits. So every year there's a monitoring event for new production, and there's upfront, mitigation done to make sure a project would not be allowed if it is a high likelihood of causing what we call reservoir communication to other producers.
Thanks, Reed. Interested in agree, disagree, other thoughts, Brad?
Well, Reed, thank you. I guess my question was related to what you just said at the end, which was that how are future potential developments handled? As Dan mentioned, the Osage, but the Osage reservoirs, but there are plenty of others where redevelopment is absolutely possible. And so I guess I'm trying to just kind of keep in my own head what's straight about what the objective is. You're trying to stop wells that are marginal, because they're both predictable and they are supposedly leaky, although I'm not sure if there's actual leakage measurements required here to verify that. But I thought that was part of the premise as well, is that they have a lot of fugitive methane emissions historically as a marginal well. But I'm not quite clear. I understand that the concept around future development and what's allowed or what's not allowed and what the objectives are. So I don't know, maybe you've clarified it, but maybe I'm not quite clear in my head about it. So I guess I'll put my hand up.
Thanks, Brad. Reed, did you want to respond first before I go to Dan? Or
Sure. Current draft methodology issues credits every year. So it's not a bulk issuance of all the credits up front, which is where you run into a lot of problems. So, if I plug a well and I'm getting credit for the 1P reserves for just the next year, just what it would have produced in the following year. That's the only thing I'm getting a credit for. I'm not getting this bulk amount of credits for 20 or 30 years. So if somebody drills a new well at the end of that first year, I can't create any more credits from that project. And I have to do a monitoring event, log it for a verification at the end of that year. And so therefore, I have only gotten credits for what really was sequestered. I have to stop crediting the project because someone drilled a new well that threatens the 1P reserves I said were sequestered under the project. So there are safeguards in place, monitoring event and annual crediting that mean that you aren't going to credit for reserves that are accessed. I would say a petroleum engineer doing a big upfront analysis to say what they think the likelihood is of future development here is a pretty good upfront mitigation activity. Secondly, we're mostly, when we think about new development, we're not typically thinking about accessing the 1P reserves from the well we plugged. We're thinking about accessing the 2P or the 3P reserves, the things that were beyond the business as usual case of that typical well. Nobody's going to come in to drill a $9 million well to access 2 barrels of oil per day. So that's, I want to be clear, you're only getting credit for what would have, that one well would have produced. You're not getting credit for all the stuff that enhanced oil recovery or water flooding or a new horizontal is typically going to produce.
Good points. Thanks, Reed, and touches on other areas of the protocol and options that we have to mitigate risks and building conservativeness, whether it's like the crediting approach of, some protocols in this space award the entirety of, the crediting period up front to offset the large capital investment. Obviously, there's a lot of risks with that. On the flip side, trying to balance ongoing monitoring, to ensure that this is actually the case. So that's another hot topic that we'll get to, but appreciate that, Reed, that's built in as currently as ways to think about how to mitigate these risks. Dan.
Thank you. I'm gonna totally not trying to fight or be a problem, but I'm gonna disagree
What these discussions
Reed.
are for.
I'm going to disagree with Reed rather significantly. So I was hoping that this protocol would involve contracts with the mineral owners to retire the minerals. So if you're not retiring the minerals and putting a contract in place to keep them from being developed, this is a challenge. And I understand and I do agree with Reed that in some cases, if you want to redevelop a reservoir and go to some of these other 2P, 3P, whatever you want to call it, you can spend a whole bunch of money. But I'm telling you that we're in a time period where technology is advancing rapidly, and there are many, many opportunities to conventional operators by, we're doing things by changing the pump type and increasing production from, 1 barrel of oil to 5 barrels of oil, and doing other things that can make significant increases in production that don't cost $10 million, that maybe cost $50,000. And when you look at even those, 1, 2, 3Ps, it also depends on who the operator is. Sometimes, we have, stuff going from an Exxon or Shell or Chevron who has a massive overhead, and the wells are totally uneconomic and they think they're crazy and they give it to a smaller operator, and it goes from there. And so we can look at what those economics are. So for instance, here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the first well drilled in Tulsa still produces. It was drilled in 1901, produces about a barrel of oil a day. The guy who owns it is a landowner that, walks about 100 feet and turns the pump on for an hour a day. And, so even within that's, critical to him. So my only point there is that we have to be careful. And if we're not going to be retiring minerals, and fortunately, I like the idea of what Reed said about, it's an annual thing, but still, that, you can frack into formations, you can do all sorts of things, and there's a number of things that are beyond your control. And I will also say that one of the things when you are doing those reservoir analysis, those reserve analysis, and Rita's saying petroleum engineer, and we use a geologist too, and geophysics and all that, is a lot of those analyses are done with data that's available on the table at that time. And you don't always know all the information. So you're analyzing with the data that you have. So I'm just saying it's a tricky thing, and I don't want this to come back on everybody. So I'll shut up.
No, welcome your comments, Dan, as everyone on the work group. That's what these discussions are for, is to think about all the potential scenarios and make sure that it's drafted in a way that is tackling what we want and not having secondary effects that we haven't thought about. So yeah, I'd question like these 2P, 3P, definitions. Are we considering those, and is there a way to better incorporate that into the protocol so that is it possible to retire the minerals, as Dan's saying? And if it is, how do we promote that or safeguard against any, alternatives? You'll notice I did go to the next slide. I'm taking whatever ways I can to kind of move us along. I know, these discussions don't just pertain to certain sections of the protocol, but I think there's some important things to think about when it comes to ownership. Is that another perspective to think about this? Are these actions that everyone's talking about around going and drilling to access those reserves after plugging, is that happening by certain entities or certain groups of entities more than others? Is that another way that we can think about this right now? And I know there's some hands up to talk about, the continued like economic reserves and things, so we can go back to it, but just wanted to layer this in terms of ownership. The proposal is that a project developer is someone with an active account with us. That's standard. We're saying it may be an oil and gas well owner or operator. It could be someone who specializes in project development. Project developer could be well plugging service providers, other entities. What does that look like? Why or why not? They need to demonstrate that they have ownership of the well and the land. I mean, Dan talked about the landowner. Does that differ? Is there landowner and well operator ownership differences that we should be aware of? And then who owns these marginal wells in your opinion or experience? Is it larger companies, individuals, landowners? And how should we be thinking about this? Yeah, and I included a question there, how should we prevent new drills or leakage? So I think that pertains pretty directly to this discussion. And we also included tribal lands, which we can get to further on location, but could start that discussion. Reed, you probably want to respond to some of those comments and maybe add.
No, I mean, I think a lot of this will be handled by taking a look at the draft protocol at some point. It's got a multi-page element on making sure we monitor for and prevent any issues with a project based on new development. And that's all drafted by another one, Sewell and Ryder Scott. There's also some really big provisions on what sort of petroleum engineers can be used under the methodology. And it's very restrictive to only a certain small set that are largely very, very large organizations. On the legal permanent side, getting a conservation easement on the minerals, there may be an argument that we should do a higher credit issuance upfront if we have some sort of 50-year or 100-year conservation easement on minerals. Today, it's annual issuance, which functionally sort of prevents a lot of these issues that we're talking about. Because if something happens at a monitoring event and we realize that they're going to come in and water flood the area and access the conserved reserves, we just can't credit anymore. And a project developer is not going to want to do a project where they funded a lot of shutting down wells and suddenly they can't create credits after the first year. So we don't view that as a super likely scenario that a project developer would take that on. On this one topic, we believe adamantly that the operator should not be able to do a project alone. We've run this through a number of times and believe that there are too many misaligned incentives without a project developer in between the operator and the registry. Most of these operators, when we look at marginal wells, there are 10,000 operators. 1,000 of them have drilled wells. 9,000 of them have never drilled an oil well. But the average size is often 5 or 6 employees. And their goal on getting a project done is going to be the revenue generation. Their goal is not to be running multiple projects over time to maintain high integrity. So we definitely feel, at least the way that the draft protocol is written is it requires an independent project developer who does not operate wells, does not drill wells, and is not the owner of these marginal wells.
Thanks, Reed. Yeah, curious if other folks agree with like the annual crediting. And again, that's a later slide, but is that enough to mitigate this risk? And then also on the mineral, like retiring minerals and conservation easements on minerals. I saw some heads nodding. Like, do you agree with that? Would you be able to have a different approach to your crediting if you had that, or you could get more credits up front because there is that safeguard with the easement on the minerals. All good points. And then ownership. Yeah, we typically for our protocols, it could be the actual owner or facility owner or well owner, like with our other industrial or waste protocols, methane protocols. It can be, correct me if I'm wrong, Rachel, but a landfill operator or, a facility owner of an adipic acid plant, or they can elect to work with a project developer who has experience in carbon markets and carbon accounting to take care of that for them. It's all options within our protocol, but we need to see like transfer of rights then if it's not the person who owns the actual, in this case, well or materials, that they've transferred those rights to the project developer who's a different entity in that case. So we've drafted it as flexibility, but Reed mentions a good point from his perspective, like should there be limitations on who can be a project developer? So lots to think about. Wes?
The only additional thing I was going to bring
Thanks,
up,
Dan.
because I didn't hear it stated. So in some cases, the well owner will be the operator, will be the landowner, will be the mineral owner. So you could have one entity that owns absolutely everything. And I really hesitate to leave them out of someone who can operate a project because they're voluntarily getting rid of or leaving the reserves in the ground, and they're going to have multiple layers of third-party review of their project. So I guess I'm not getting the link there to where we should leave them out because it would potentially limit them from wanting to do it. But back to the other point, there's instances where you will have a landowner, an oil and gas owner, an operator, and several hundred mineral owners. So there's going to be instances where getting a conservation easement is not possible. I can't remember who was talking about it, but the well from 1901 may have had a mineral owner who signed a lease and then left it to his kids, who then left it to his kids, who then left it to their kids, who then left it to their kids. And now you have 50 different mineral owners, 35 of which cannot be found, which is when you then, at least in the Illinois Basin, you've got to go to court, have a receiver appointed, everything else, and they could sign off on the conservation easement. But I think you would want to have some kind of notification to the Department of Natural Resources where they're aware of that easement. And maybe then you would be more comfortable with having them go multiple years without having another review. And maybe you just kick it out and say it's every 5 years, every 10 years, kind of like what Reed was getting to. But I just wanted to point out that the mineral ownership can be split so very far and wide that you may not need landowner approval for the conservation easement, but you may have to be finding the mineral owners, and how you convey the title to that is probably, at least what we do here, we have title opinions that can be purchased from attorneys' offices, and they may already have them from when they were producing oil and gas so that they can show who needs to get paid for what.
Okay, all really helpful. Yeah, it would be good to get a sense of what is common or typical for these types of wells and ownership. Is it, the case that you're saying, Wes, where they're the landowner, the well owner, the mineral owner? Like, is that common? Is that more rare? I don't know. Or are we talking about, major corporations or individuals or a mixed bag? Is that important? Taking note of your comment around why wouldn't we allow the owner and operator to be the project developer. In our other protocols, as I mentioned, we don't restrict against that because we have the third party checks and the different requirements. So definitely an option. And then, yeah, I guess taking note of like the complexities with the mineral ownership. I'm hearing it probably doesn't make sense to make that a requirement in the protocol because there's so much complexity, but maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's an option that if people are able to get that easement and have the mineral rights or whatever that looks like, then they have other flexibilities or ability to get additional credits faster. I don't know. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, Wes, if you had thoughts. See, you're off mute, but no pressure.
Oh,
No,
oh,
no,
good.
no, no.
I think
Okay,
you
thanks.
summarized that very well.
Okay, appreciate it. Reed.
Yeah, conservation easements can be really hard to get, but not necessarily required in order to run a project because we're doing annual issuance. So that sort of breaks against this idea of new drilling. But it is an advantage. If you got a conservation easement, you can guarantee greater permanence. There's going to be cases when the operator owns 100% of the minerals. You can probably get an easement on that area. On the other piece, no ambition to keep the operator out. All what we're saying is just in addition to the operator, you need an independent third party. That third party project developer hedges against additionality risk, handles the conflict of interest in methane accounting. There are, use of proceeds risks that are taken care of there, regulatory overlap and legal risk, verification and dependence risk, market and buyer acceptance risk. We see a long, long list of things that if an oil and gas operator who has, let's say, I'll paint a picture for you. You got a 5% company owns 100 wells. Their aspiration is to generate as much money as possible plugging those wells. Their aspiration is not to run project 2 or 3 or 4. They got 100 wells, trying to plug them all, walk away from the business. The likelihood of finding loopholes or looking for ways to generate as much cash as possible is greater than one working with a project developer who's got a number of different, projects to run, maintain a reputation of running these projects. So we've just seen running projects now, this is our third that we've done, that independent project developer adds a layer of risk management that otherwise is really difficult to do, especially in an industry that's so, let's say, in its initial form, this is going to be a risky protocol. There's never been an oil and gas protocol like this. And so our goal has been to limit risk and limit scope in its initial version. If we run 50 projects underneath this protocol and they all go great, I think there's a great argument to be made that maybe we can step away from having that independent third party to limit risk. But our aspiration has been in the upfront to try and add as many layers to prevent risk as possible.
Yeah, lots of options, things to consider. As I mentioned, our other protocols leave that as an option. You can choose to do your own project as an owner or operator of a facility or something like that, which comes, with potential risks that Reed's highlighting, or you can choose to pull in a technical consultant or experienced project developer. Yeah, it's a question of if we should, in this case, uniquely get maybe ahead of some of those risks or not. Something that we'll have to talk about internally at the reserve as well, from like just our programmatic and broader application of who's eligible as an owner. Meg.
Sorry, I couldn't get enough mute. Thanks. That's very helpful, clarifying information. And another question I had, it was helpful that Reed, that you said that the credits are issued annually. When do they? What I couldn't quite figure out is, when do they start? Is it at the start of the project or after the well is plugged and verified?
If everyone's okay with it, I will jump ahead a couple of slides. I know, Rachel, you were cute to present this, so we can jump back. Maybe it's helpful context. The proposal right now is the initial expenditure of the plugging process that would initiate what we define as the start date of the project. And that is the proposal up for discussion, debate. Really, when we talk about start date, we want to think about what is the action, what is the first thing that's triggering that action. So at a facility that's maybe doing abatement technology, it could be a certain when it started to abatement started, or agricultural practice change can be when they've changed that practice on land. In this case, we are saying that the plugging action is the start date of the project, but how do we define that plugging action? The proposal is an initial expenditure. I don't know. We have a lot of questions around like, what is that typical initial expenditure? Is it one of 2 payments or one of 10 payments? What is the timeline for when, that first thing happens and then the plug is actually done? And then that goes into all of the different dates we have around like reporting periods, verification periods, crediting periods. Hopefully it's okay. I jumped ahead. I don't know, Rachel, to put you on the spot if you had anything to add here before opening it up to your response, Meg, on that or others. And then we can, of course, jump back to Rachel. I don't know. Did I miss anything or did you
No,
want to
I
add
think
something?
that's good. And it, yeah, definitely makes sense to just pivot into it since it's fits into the discussion right now. So yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I see it spurred some comments too, so that's great. Brad?
Sure. I guess my initial reaction, I'm open to learning more and hearing and thinking more, but my initial reaction is that it seems a little odd because there is uncertainty as to whether the job will be done well. And so certainly for the orphan and abandoned well cases, the preference has been some sort of test to be done afterwards to ensure that it's not leaking anything. And then once there is a successful completion test, then credits could be issued. And that seems like we're not talking about a very long time. We are talking about an outlay of capital, but it seems like that is a confidence taking measure to wait until the job was done successfully.
Thanks. Appreciate that. Heather?
I have a few comments that'll span kind of what we were talking about before and then now this, but on the discussion around the operator being the project developer on CAR, I think that, I personally have worked for third-party project developers and now work for a owner operator of gas or oil and gas production. And I mean, I don't necessarily agree that the developers are necessarily neutral. I think sometimes developers understand loopholes better than anyone. So I don't necessarily agree with that. The exclusion of the operator being the project developer. In terms of start date, I agree with the previous comment that the successful P&A of the well seems like the natural start date. From my perspective, it kind of aligns with my understanding of carbon markets broadly, that the start date of a project is the day the emissions reductions started happening, which would be at the point of plugging from my perspective. And then the last thing I'll say is on restrictive covenants or different tools to mitigate from development in the future. I think it's a really interesting idea to accelerate an issuance if those mechanisms exist and are, able to be verified and whatnot. I think that would be a huge mechanism for just like incentivizing the behavior change that is intended by the methodology. As I think Mackenzie, you alluded to, there's a large capital expenditure at the project activity. And so matching carbon revenue as much as is reasonable with the expenditure of the operator makes sense. And you might incentivize more action that way. So I'll pause there.
All great comments. Thank you. Notes. Arjun?
Sorry. So yeah, just some comments on how we might think about project start date. So, I mean, just to bear in mind, I assume it's safe to say that no credits would be issued until the verification that the P&A had been done properly had been performed. So there shouldn't be any risk of sort of premature credit issuance before that happens. I would think that's pretty easy to safeguard against. But with respect to what the project start date should be, I think that the considerations should be, when do we have confidence that emissions that are covered under the project will no longer be occurring. And so if it is the case that at the time of project expenditure, production has ceased, and if we can have confidence that that also means that the related on-site emissions of methane have ceased, then first expenditure could be a reasonable start date. Absent the confidence that emissions have ceased at that time, then I could see the argument for waiting until P&A has occurred.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And you're always looking at the slides and thinking maybe it would have been helpful to include this or that. But quickly, I think we should try to keep in mind as well sort of our dates and things in terms of reporting periods, verification periods, and crediting periods as well. So like the start date would define when the project is starting and when that reporting period goes back to. But if a project is, listing with us, which means they're submitting a listing document and saying that they plan to do this and this is their start date and it's tied to a certain action. In this case, the proposal is the expenditure, or would it be the completion of the plug? That's a question. But then time would obviously move on from there, and there would be a reporting period of data where they would be gaining the credits for a proposal on that annual basis, and then a verification period after that. So there's a few timelines, I guess, to be thinking about. Like, is it okay to go with the initial expenditure because credits wouldn't be issued until after the P&A, I think is the definition, is completed? Like, how quickly does that happen? I don't know. That's a question. Is it within a year? Is it 3 years? And that might be something to consider of how it moves in parallel with our timelines, because typically reporting periods are typically for these projects 12 months or an initial period of 24 months. So would it get captured under that? I guess is my thought and question too. Reed?
The way the draft protocol currently reads is that the first issuance is 1 year after the state issues its certification that the last well was plugged. So, the state has to come out and certify. So that would be when the first issuance was. The question is, when did baseline emissions begin? That we found in practice, and Heather, this will resonate with you. If you know that you're going to plug a well, you stop optimizing production that day. And so your production is going to fall off a cliff 4 or 5 months ahead of when you actually break ground on plugging it. So our argument was, or at least what you see in the methodology that you will see, is upon contract signage to complete the project is when your first action to stop optimizing and increasing your production. That's when baseline emissions start. Essentially, the amount you don't produce from the reserve report from that date forward is like when baseline emissions happen. But the first issuance is a year after all the certifications from the state are done. As far as Heather, your point on the developer not being implicitly neutral, 100% agree with you. Our argument was just that required inclusion of a developer, an independent developer, limits risk. That's all it was. But yeah, the state has got to come out and certify every single plug that was done, and annual issuance 1 year after that final certification date is what's been proposed most of the time, unless California is a little bit more difficult, but most of the time you're seeing those certification letters come out within 3 months of when the well was plugged.
Thanks, Reed. Yeah, so I guess the question is does everyone agree that that's when baseline emissions start, is when these question mark contracts are signed, some sort of initial payment spent, or is it that when the plug is complete, that's when you're going the different paths of baseline versus project? When does that start? That's what we're looking for. Miguel.
Yeah, thanks. Speaking about this project started, well, I agree with the definition about the baseline. Yeah, I agree with that. The other part is the project started here. I think we have to look into two different implications. First, I think it creates well, the project start date to be the earliest date, committed to expenditures. That can be a little tricky, maybe the best way, but that will be also something that has to be considered probably by the BBB is um, the certification or the paying for the certification of the petroleum engineering firm to certify that it has that it will be uh, blocked and everything. Um, Maybe that will be one of them. I agree that probably the best way is that the project start date should be the way in which it was blocked and it was certified by the petroleum engineering that was well blocked. I think that's the best approach here because typically it ranges, I think, for permit approval ranges from 30 to 90 days, something like that. That depends, of course, on each state and a lot of bureaucracy. The plugging operations, maybe I don't know how much, but probably between 1 to 2 weeks or something like that. That depends also on the complexity of that. And yeah, so I think from the previous or the draft version of it, not sure if this is still there, Reed, but the methodology required that the project was to be plugged within 24 months of the first well. So I think that's that. And yeah.
So Miguel, are you saying to leave it as the initial expenditure, but have additional requirements that the completion of the well is done within 24 months you mentioned, or are you proposing that the plug completion and the state certification be the start date?
Yeah, I think just no, just I think just to like what are the consequences of that expenditure? I think that will cause us is more problems because
More
what is
risks or
good? Yeah,
questions? Mm,
more because what are you going to define as something that is the expenditure? Whether that's going to be the contractor that is going to plug it or the petroleum engineering firm that is going to certify the reserves and everything. I I know that this is common practice for the projects in car and some other registries to put the project start date as the date in which it was committed to expenditure, but I think here it's a little different. And so I am not opposed on that. That definitely creates a more conservativeness in the amount of credits that are going to be issued because the more time that it passes, the less credits that you're going to have. So the project start date to be the first day in which it was already plugged and certified at the PFF. I think that would be the best, I think, more streamlined option and still safeguard.
thank you.
I think it's in place, but yeah. Mhm.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and recognize that at this point in the time on the meeting that a few people have had to drop off. Of course, this is still being recorded and we can share it with them. And we'll continue the discussion until 12 noon Pacific time, but just recognizing we've had a few people that had to go to other meetings. I guess any pushback on changing the start date to completion of the plug action of when the state is, I think Reed, you said the state needs to certify it, and it seems like I'm hearing 30 to 90 days. Like it doesn't seem like it's a long period of time from when the initial expenditure happens and the plug is complete, if that's right. Is it safer to go with a start date of, I think P&A was the definition, or plug or state, check off that this is done? Reed?
Just clarifying, Mackenzie, by project start date, do you mean that's when the baseline emissions begin to be calculated?
Yeah, that would be basically like that would be where we would look back to the first time at which credits could be generated.
Yeah.
Is that fair, Rachel? It's the date at which you would define the baseline versus the project emissions and calculate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because we would have under our normal processes is the initial reporting period would align with the project start date, which would also align with the crediting period. So ideally, yeah, the moment of ceasing the emissions that we're crediting for would be aligned with the start date that we choose.
My only concern is that might unintentionally increase emissions. An operator that is going to plug a well stops optimizing their production, they start to produce less emissions. And if they know that they get zero credit for that amount, they're going to keep increasing production and try and run as much oil and gas out of the ground as possible up until that date where they plug the well. Whereas in a business as usual case, if they're going to plug the well, they're going to start bringing production down and no longer investing in that well.
So you're saying like project emissions wouldn't be captured, basically, like if they
No,
choose
not project
to.
emissions. Like they're going, usually in a business as usual case, if I'm going to plug a well, I stop investing in that well, which means its production goes down, meaning there's less emissions headed into my plugging date. If I know that I'm not going to get any credit for what I don't produce during that time period, I'm going to ramp up and produce as much as possible all the way up to that plugging date. Does that make sense? That's the way I maximize the amount of cash that I would get. Whereas if you set the start date at when they decide that they're going to do a project, which we can talk about the ways to define that ambiguous date. But if you set it at that, then you capture, you incentivize the operator to produce less up until the plug-in date.
I see. So there's a risk that if we aren't capturing that as a part of the project, it may actually increase emissions or extraction or whatever during that time frame, and that wouldn't be captured by the project, and then could, right, not capture all the emissions. Okay, noted. Agree, disagree, Wes? I think you're next.
I would go with both, I guess. I see what Reed's saying. There's another scenario that could also play out, especially where we operate at, and that involves the river and road closures and whether or not you can get equipment. You may be shut out from getting to the well for 3 months, which would also play into the well must have produced the past 7 of the past 12 months. And you may have operators running back out to turn the well back on because they no longer meet the protocol. Because the well has to have been running for 7 out of the last 12 months. And if the well's been down for 4 months because they weren't able to get to it, and because it has to be plugged and abandoned as the start date, then you could run into that scenario as well. I'm not saying it's going to happen, and it may be so limited that it doesn't matter. I don't know, but I could see either side of the coin, honestly, and I almost question whether or not it can be an either or, but as Reed was just saying, it may be better to have it as the typical initial expenditure. So that's all I had.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and I think it goes without saying, but a reminder, like the well obviously has to be plugged before, like, and completed before credits are issued. So this is really talking about the start date, not that there's a risk that it wouldn't be complete before crediting. Well, I mean, crediting in terms of, yeah, please.
I'm sorry to jump in, and I don't know. I had to switch to my phone, and I can't figure this part out. But I guess maybe one of you can clarify. Read maybe there seems to be a distinction that I don't get between professional firm develops a report which identifies the baseline volume, and then some sort of real-time behavior that you're accounting for, which is affecting that baseline volume. Can you help me understand that better, please?
Mackenzie, I'm happy to jump in here if it's helpful.
Yep, go ahead.
So the professional petroleum engineering firm comes up with the amount of economic reserves that the well will produce over a certain period of time. Let's assume that's January 1st of 2026. That gives us a number. The operator is agreeing to plug these wells early, and so they begin their plugging operation April 1st. What we're saying is that, you can look at the amount of reserves that are being sequestered in two ways. You can look at those reserves that are sequestered from April 1st on, or you can look at the reserves that are sequestered when they decided to plug the wells. And if they decided to plug the wells right after they got their reserve report on January 1st, then there is a greater amount of reserves potentially that they're keeping in the ground because they no longer optimize production in between those two dates. This is not a hill I'm going to die on, but it is one that we found in practice. Most operators make a choice of, if I stop producing right now, do I get a little bit more credit on this carbon credit project? And the beautiful answer I can give is yes, if you change your behavior and you produce less here and less emissions, that is a greater carbon credit value. But if they say, if I say no, you don't get anything between now and when the well is actually fully plugged, then they're going to produce as much as possible, get as much oil and gas out of the ground, make as much money as possible up until that date.
Helpful, thank you. Yeah, I'm hearing that both dates are important, whether what's the start date is still a question, but it's helpful to understand how we're setting the baseline and then also what kind of actions are incentivized or not. Heather?
I don't know. I feel like my comments maybe are a little bit confused now, but I guess maybe just the suggestion is like to see all of the definitions like together of start date, reporting
Sure.
period, crediting period. Like I just think kind of a holistic understanding of that, and I echo some of Brad's confusions, but that might be helpful and not make a decision here and now on just help us orient ourselves a little better.
Makes total sense. Yeah, my mind was already going there. I think Rachel and I both were thinking it'd be helpful to have a visual of some kind with some of the dates and where things happen along the way, and what those actions are. So we can definitely prepare that. Jay.
So I was also, I guess, kind of consistent with Brad's comment and with Heather's comment. I think some of these definitions are confounding in terms of, they're highly related, and so if you make a decision on one definition, it can affect how you need to define the other definitions. So trying to talk about them individually, I think, is challenging. I think that's what I hear, and I also share that. But one of the points that I guess I just wanted to respond or put out there relative to, I think, what Reed said in these, because I was trying to determine whether whether the reserve report sounds like the reserve report is going to be crucial to these projects in some form or another. And again, I need to educate myself better regarding these reserve reports. But relative to what Reed just said, does it make sense to put some sort of expiration date on these reserve reports? Because I think what he was saying is they can do this report and then that can change their actions. But would it make sense to kind of limit how much they could, a period of time that they could do that, so that you have the reserve report that starts that reserve report, if they're going to do a project, there's only a certain amount of time they can rely on that reserve report. If it expires, then they need to go back to the engineering firm and get a new report and then start the process over. Again, I'm kind of responding to what we've seen in a lot of projects, which is people, make plans to do projects and then, 6 months, a year, 2 years go by, and then all the conditions of that project have changed, and it actually impedes kind of them, not only them doing the project, but potentially the verification. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and we can definitely lay out some timelines all in one place so it's easier to see. It's a good start to the discussion, but agree, not deciding on anything for start date today without seeing that makes sense. And we can think about some of the timelines. I mean, for some of our other protocols, there's options for start dates too, so we can think about that. Like I'm thinking of our grasslands protocol for avoided conversion. Like the start date can be that you've put a conservation easement on, or it can be that you've submitted a project to the reserve, and then you still have to get the conservation easement done before your reporting period and verification happens. But there are options, so we can also think about that and what the timelines look like for the follow-up actions, basically, of what we're talking about, I think. Mark.
Yes, I have a kind of related question, and excuse my naivete on this topic. But for the reserve calculation these professional petroleum engineers are going to be performing, the economically accessible reserves, which is, the definition, that's a time varying sort of thing. What is economical? It depends on the market price of whatever, product you're trying to produce is, and it depends on, the price of extraction, which will change over time depending on the technology improving and whatnot. How do you account for, or can you fill me in on your thoughts about that? Maybe Reed is the best person to answer this.
Sure, there are luckily we're depending on here systems that are let's say well vetted over the last 30 years in the oil and gas industry. A lot of these are really clear rules under the SEC. The things that are key are, how much in oil and gas is going to be produced on the current decline curve? What's the lease operating expense that is required in order to produce that? And then what is the price of the commodity that's expected to sell? That's based on a lot of historical data. One of the luxuries of this protocol is most of these wells have been producing for 40 years. And so you have a lot of data to work with on at least how much the lease operating expense has consistently been. You also have, most of the time, these wells are surrounded by very similar wells. So you can see and corroborate those results. As far as the price of the commodity, most of the time it's set on the New York Mercantile Exchange strip. That's what we see the most in these petroleum engineers. But across the board, when you compare a petroleum engineering reserve report for a marginal well versus actuals of those marginal wells, it's like 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 times the reserve report is lower than the amount that was actually produced from the well. They're naturally just super, hyper conservative. That is not the case with new wells. A well that has just begun producing, almost always the reserve report is going to be at or higher than the amount that well ends up producing, which is another reason why we want to focus on older oil and gas wells. Mark, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Very helpful.
Okay, thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on the time and see now we have 6 minutes left in our scheduled meeting. So I am hesitant to jump into another big topic on, say, additionality or crediting approaches. This has all been really helpful. I think some things we're hearing around dates and timelines is it would be really beneficial to lay it out in a single slide as to the practice change itself and the timelines and how things are changing across time, and then also our program requirements as it relates to start date, reporting periods, verification, crediting periods, and put those, in a single place so we can talk about everything holistically. So we will work on that. It shouldn't be too difficult to bring together into a visual for a next discussion to make some decisions on start date and other dates and what is the definition or action that defines a start date. Yeah, I am hesitant with the last 5 minutes to jump into anything else that's, substantial that we haven't started on, unless anyone disagrees. I'm happy to use the remaining few minutes for any final comments or thoughts on anything we have discussed as it relates to definition, ownership, start date. I think were the main areas we talked about here today. Of course, we've taken lots of notes and we have the recording. So then we will start to edit the protocol based on that. And can share it with you as soon as we can, or bits and pieces of it that have been reviewed and discussed, and then propose what that looks like given the comments. Rachel, have I missed anything from our perspective that I should cover, summarize, and I assume you agree not to, jump into the performance standard test or crediting approach with the limited 4 minutes we have remaining now. So any final comments or thoughts on what we've discussed? Yeah, Jay, please.
So I guess just to use the final time regarding the project start date, I just wanted to share some lessons learned from, again, the Orphan Wells experience relative to this P&A, the plugging and abandon date. And again, it seems like, I guess we were naive to think that, the plugging date was a very clear date. But what we found under the orphan wells is that there are some variations. Some of those were program specific in terms of, the program was looking for when cement was poured down the hole, which again, that was the way they defined it. But there's a variety of other dates that could be considered the plugging dates in terms of, and I think they also might be specific to the locality, the state, or so when you file the paperwork, that you say you plugged the well. And then I also heard that there was a reference to, when the state approves that the well was plugged. And those dates can be, months apart, or we've seen them be months apart in terms of, you file the paperwork and then it can take the state several months to review that, and then actually, give you the post that it was actually approved. So again, I think it's simple to say, oh, this is the plugging date, but please be aware that that's, there's a variety of definitions as to when, when that date occurred, and they can be months or potentially longer apart. Again, I'm not familiar with all the processes in all the states, and I would just caution on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well received. I'm sort of thinking in my mind, maybe there's a couple timelines that we can lay out and get your input on, from the idea of plugging or contract or initial expenditure, whatever those like first actions are, all the way to when the plugging action happens. And then to your point, Jay, like what are kind of the subcategories under that, and how do we define when it's complete within that range? So yeah, I'm starting to visualize maybe like a timeline of the practicality of what happens, and then also the timelines of our program requirements and how those layer on top of each other. So yeah, well received. Thank you. Isai?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess following on the start date definition is when you mentioned something about projects trying to decline the production right after the expenditures began. Are there any safeguards already in the methodology to confirm that production actually started to decrease? Or in case that the production actually increased after those expenditures, are they going to receive less credit?
Yeah, I don't know the details of that. That's included in the draft read. I think the assumption is that since you've set the start date as that initial expenditure, there's an incentive for them to decrease or lower production versus the other situation you were talking about. But I think at least that's my understanding. And if we went with another date, we need to build those
Right.
safeguards in then, yeah.
Yeah, that would be the assumption, right? That's what we would expect, but that's not the case all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost imagine that as potentially being, is that project emissions then? If the start date is the initial expenditure and then they start
Exactly.
extracting more oil and gas, it's almost that would be removed from the credits because it would be emissions that happened in the project scenario then in that case. So
Correct. So I wonder if that is included or not in the draft.
The draft methodology as written calculates the total amount of the emission reduction in the first year, 12 months after the well has been certified. So at that time, you can compare actual production versus the reserve report. So if the reserve report said the well in a business as usual case was going to produce 1,000 barrels and the well only produced, 800 up until the day it was plugged, then you have a 200 barrel section of mitigated reserves. So that can be calculated each year at the verification point. Mackenzie, one small point for project emissions, which is the emissions of either embodied cement in the plug or emissions of diesel used to plug the well. That was going to happen in the project scenario. The operator was already going to plug the wells. They were just going to do it at a different date. So the way that the current methodology is written is that project emissions are not taken out of the baseline because they would happen in the business as usual case, just at a different date.
thank you. It's something to think about for quantification. Is that the right approach, or is there variability in how the the plugging action happens, and should actual emissions in that be considered a question that we'll talk about at a next meeting. Well, thank you all for the 2 hours of your time and all of your comments, questions, feedback. We really appreciate it. Recognize we're a minute over, so I'll wrap this up quickly. You should have everything you need from us in emails in terms of next steps and meeting dates and information. But just a reminder on the screen that our next meeting is in a couple weeks' time on the 28th for 2 hours again. And we also have the request for feedback for these sections. Rachel and I have lots of work ahead of us, which is great to build in these comments and redraft sections that we can share with you. So stay tuned via email, and of course, feel free to reach out to us via email or phone or whichever as needed. If you have any questions or comments in the meantime, we appreciate it.
Will there be
Have a good
additional
rest.
sets of questions? Will there be additional sets of questions beyond the one that was sent to us, or is just the one?
There will definitely be additional questions that just covers sections 2 and 3 on eligibility. Once we get to quantification and MRV, there'll be more questions. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.